Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm here with my buddy Jeffrey C. Pugh, and we're gonna have some fun. We're gonna have some fun talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This is the first of a series of live sessions that are going. Um, we're going to be going on through the fall, um, and it's gonna be an exciting journey because unlike previous times we've done classes here at Homebrewed, we aren't just bringing together a whole bunch of different scholars or specialists in the area. Yes, there's a whole bunch of Bonhoeffer scholars that are a part of this. And we aren't just trying to find the right readings each week so you get to hear Bonhoeffer in his own words in the context. And we aren't just going to be unpacking it in conversation with your questions and such. Jeff and I have been working for quite a while on the audio documentary, The Rise of Bonhoeffer, which is going to be an important and essential part that hopefully allows those of you who are new to Bonhoeffer to have a context, a history, a framing for reading him and hearing what kind of contemporary Bonhoeffer scholars are doing when they wrestle with the history and his thought and what it's like to engage it and take it seriously today. So this is a rather new experiment of sorts for homebrewed Christianity, and that's why I'm glad to be joined by Jeff, who's just one of my favorite people on top of being smart and fun to work with. So thank you for being here, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tripp.
Oh yeah, yeah. This is
That was
gonna be
a
fun.
great opening, wasn't it? So clever and so full of wit. And
Yeah, well, I'm I'm hanging out in the library at Princeton Theological Seminary. So I'm attempting not to be as animated and as loud as I normally am when I'm in my basement by myself. Um, I said, "Is the room have a door? Am I allowed to make noise?" You'll be fine. You'll be fine. And I've already got a few looks. But what we are hoping to do today, we've got some questions people have already sent in from the first episode of Rise of Bonhoeffer, and I want to kind of give a little layout of how things are going to work between for everyone that has signed up for the class. Which, if you haven't, riseofbonhoeffer.com, and that way, after next week when the second episode of the audio documentary comes out, that
it is
following
straight fire. It is straight fire. It's awesome.
yeah. Next week, when the episode comes out, and we'll send y'all an email. You'll get it, but and you'll get a reminder of what we'll be reading and discussing the following week. So it's kind of like there's a episode of the audio documentary, and then you'll get an email that will have an interview with one of the Bonhoeffer scholars, like the full long interview. Tomorrow, you'll get an email with the whole interview edited up of us and Reggie Williams. And then next week, you get boom, episode 2. Then the following week, we will discuss, unpack, conversation with Reggie, episode 2, the reading, and we'll kind of gear our attention towards the areas questions came in. That's our plan. So it kind of goes audio documentary week, reading, scholar week with live Q&A, and it just rotates. It rotates. It's going to be fun. And for all of you that sign up, we will have it all nice and laid out on the class resource page. So go to riseofbonhoeffer.com if you want to join up. If you have, we'll be putting the outline and access to everything on that page, be it the audio documentary, the interviews, the live sessions after they're done, reading schedule and such. So, and next week, Jeff is going to be in 2 weeks. Jeff will be in South
Africa.
And Andrew Root's going to join for the live stream. So,
and maybe I'll get Robert Vosloo, who was featured on our first episode, to listen with me. So,
well, then y'all can grade it. You can send me a grade. Like, Tripp, not bad.
And Andy Root's a joy to, just to talk with.
Yeah. All right. So that's kind of the flow and such. And remember, if you have questions that come up in any of it, just respond to any of the class emails and they will all get compiled, and we'll use frequency of topics and questions to determine what we're going to do. And if you're ever going to miss something, don't worry. All of it gets recorded and put on the resource page. Tell your friends. All right. So, Jeff, one of the things, there were a few topics that came up in the first one, in the first session, that we got some questions on, and I've seen messages on social media and such. I've even had a couple people at the event here at Princeton I'm at walk up and start talking to me about episode 1. And I think that the kind of two addresses, but of Hitler's address and Bonhoeffer's address, when we do the flash forward, struck a chord. And the clergy who were at this event, in emails and on social media, all do that moment of, oh, is there a connection, a resonance between the kind of energy of the nationalism we saw in Germany, in Hitler, that kind of cult of personality that both Robert Vosloo and Vicky Barnett in the episode bring up. What are the connections and contrasts when you think of the kind of challenges we're facing in the West, both in America and in Europe, where there's a rise of kind of right-wing religion, authoritarianism, a kind of culture of an anxious and panicked culture, where the desire for the strong man, the cult of personality, is growing. I'm interested in you kind of like helping us begin to think about it, because that contrast is there just in the history in the episode. But I mean, I had someone walk up to me saying, "I got to go get on the live stream." And they're like, "I know, but come on, like, what do you think?"
Okay, so I think last or in one of our earlier sessions for this particular class, I did warn against the too easy connection between Hitler and, say, for instance, Trump. But one of the things probably, that and we are not Germany in 1933, but I think I did say that there were also family sort of resemblances, and I think worldwide, globally, what we're seeing right now is a family resemblance between that kind of struggle between authoritarianism and a more democratic system. And so pretty much everybody that's listening to this knows how that plays out in Germany, with a response to what was considered to be a nascent democracy, the Weimar Republic. It's not able to really get off the ground so much. It's battered by the aftermath of World War One, battered by the Versailles Treaty and the sort of strictures that are put on Germany for that. The economic system globally in the 20s collapsing. But one of the ways that authoritarians used to also undermine that system was to keep pointing out how degenerate it was. Its art was degenerate. Its politics was degenerate. The people were degenerate. I guess when we think about that play, Cabaret, we see, sort of the echoes of that. So right now, then, we're sort of faced with a situation where, like you said, there are authoritarian movements, right-wing movements globally, that are trying to undermine democracy, because democracy essentially is a polity of pluralism, has a lot of different voices. And when you have a lot of different voices, things are going to get messy. It's not going to, you're going to have all of these places, arguments, spaces to be negotiated, things to be navigated. So democracy in and of itself is maybe not necessarily, a little heretical here, the most stable political structure. But I think probably one of the things now that's becoming increasingly disturbing in the American context is something that we see replicated, a kind of rhetoric of othering that is now being drilled down with, and we just have to name names here. Trump and Vance, say, for instance, in what they were doing with Springfield, Ohio, a kind of creating a conscience. There's a book by Claudia Kuhns, The Nazi Conscience. And she talks in this book about how people's conscience became constructed. Their deepest identity, for instance, tied to land, to nation, to state, their deepest identity is used and then weaponized against anybody that can be framed as the other. It's those people. And so what you get then is a situation where you might have grown up with Jewish neighbors. You might have gone to school with them. They might have been some of your best friends. But over a process of time, the erosion of responsibility to another human being becomes flattened to a kind of sense where you're only responsible to your nation or to your state. So that what happens then is when they come to take your Jewish neighbor away, you don't say, oh, how horrible it is that they're taking away Hans. What you end up saying is, oh, how horrible it is that Hans is a Jew. So do you see the kind of the moral shift that is created in the minds of a populace with the continual drumbeat of these people are coming to, fear and anxiety and all of the things that are used by demagogues to create a situation where your moral responsibility for other human beings seems to stop at their identification with the state or their identification even with a political party. And I think one of the things that we're facing now, and one of the powers of Bonhoeffer, is his inability to look at the other and not to be manipulated into seeing the other as an automatic enemy or as a threat, but as one who is also made in the image of God. That was probably too long, but let me just stop there.
Oh, no. I think that's really helpful. And here's something that I had never really thought of until we started this project and getting to read a lot of Victoria Barnett's work just on the rise of Nazi in general, like her book on bystanders, a look at the Confession Church and its demise, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, is the 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 power of communication of the authoritarian is connected. The energy that they're seizing is connected to the material conditions, and you named it, right? Like this rapid inflation, post World War I, a kind of cultural shame on losing. Like there's all these elements that are there where a populace has a deep fear and anxiety, and when one is alienated from the past after World War I, right? Like this vision of this burgeoning identity of German identity, while all the nation states in Europe are starting to have this nation state identity. Theirs becomes the loser. Germany comes into being as a collection of people who lost a war, right? Like they weren't even an organic whole prior to World War I. And so then you get this economic move, you get this identity of the state that's there. And even like Germany, Quad Germany isn't there. Hitler's only a citizen for a year when he becomes chancellor because he had to become one. Right? Like they were in the process of making an identity, and in that space, when your identity is driven by fear and anxiety because of material conditions, cultural shame, then what gets offered from the strong man is, let me give a version of history where that shame is away, where our identity is a cherished one, where we know who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. And then he is a master at propaganda. And I think Linda asked a question that's connected to this about comment on the rise of misinformation, lies that are driving the rise of authoritarianism and fascism. Doesn't democracy depend on personal ethics and morality? Right? Like she's asking that question. You can hear it now, but one of the conversations that played out in one of the threads where there's like lots of comments online about the episode is, oh, isn't it worse now because of this technology of communication? And and I had never connected the dots till doing this project, that he harnessed new technology, generated propaganda. And so this kind of the more you get to know about Bonhoeffer's family, right? They weren't really super religious, but they were anti-Hitler just because what is this guy doing? We can't take this guy seriously, right? And part of it was their vision of democracy and the technology of citizen exchange, debate, and process, and the people that end up in leadership. They're upper middle class, they're highly educated. They didn't anticipate the kind of populist uprising that a heartbeat of a culture is seized because of this propaganda, and that propaganda is giving them, right, then an identity in their place, a nation, and rendering a history that's not determined by the shame of Versailles and how everyone else sees them. And when I think of that, and you ask about the parallels to the kind of authoritarian movements across the West, it makes me go, um, what ways should we be attending to material conditions? In what ways is real fear, anxiety, and resentment and shame at home in a people? Because we know what it can get channeled into. It can get channeled into a response to this one speech of Hitler walking in like 2 years before, 1% of the population votes for him. And now here he is giving an address. And it can also get channeled into what you see in Bonhoeffer, someone who shared a lot of the material conditions, shared the fear and anxiety, wanting to know his identity. We see in Barcelona in the episode, right? Like a kind of nationalism coming out of his mouth. But all that got channeled in a different way, and it was something you mentioned right there at the end, is it was channeled where, for one of them, the other is the outlet that justifies the new story in history, and for Bonhoeffer, the other is the offer of a different identity and a different hope in history. And and it seems to me that those distinctions are important, and they're more and more important when you realize where the energy of the rise of Nazi Germany came from.
Yeah, I mean, also, just to kind of tag on to that, one of the most disturbing aspects of all of this is how susceptible Christians are to the appeal to other. How susceptible American Christians are right now in this moment to an appeal that really is replicating the third temptation of the Matthew narrative, of the temptation narrative where Satan offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. I mean, why is it, or what is it that is being sold, that the vast majority of American evangelicals, for instance, 87%, seem to be on board with this particular agenda of hatred uh, toward the other, toward the immigrant, toward the stranger in society. And some of this goes to the fact that psychologically speaking, we're just very different human beings, right? And some human beings throughout time, and they always will be, are attracted to that. Just make my decisions for me. I don't want to have to deal with this. I want a dictator. I mean, there are a third of any population who want dictatorship because they just don't want to have to worry with it anymore. And democracy takes work. Well, one of the things that Bonhoeffer, is so powerful, I think, that sort of image, is that in his journey, and we talked a little bit about it in the first episode, and boy, we'll talk about it in the second. His journey to seeing the underside of history as also embraced by God, as also within the confines of grace, just gives him a different lens to understand how fear is being used, how people are being manipulated in the political sphere, how you can get to, I think it's like in 1929, 2.7% voted for Hitler, and in 1932 it was something like 36.7. So those numbers sort of ticked up so fast. And so I guess one of the things I keep coming back to with this class and is that where today are those Christians uh, who are willing to say we will not be manipulated into hating the other because somebody who wants power is demanding it of us. And unfortunately, I think it speaks to not just in 30s Germany, but also in 20s America. What is it that creates our ultimate identity as people of faith? What is it at the core? And that's what Bonhoeffer challenges us with when he asks the question, "Who is Jesus Christ for us today?"
Mm-hmm. So one of the conversations that showed up on social media and was brought up to me at this conference is the bit on Hitler assassination attempts and the question of providence. We talked about in the episode Bonhoeffer and having to grow beyond a vision of providence that justifies right killing for your country and this kind of thing. We You and I had a conversation like when going through it when we picked it as a example, right? In the when we were working on going through all the writing behind the documentary of people taking assassination attempts of Hitler as evidence for his election, right, as the Fuhrer. That was a feature we already had included before something like that happened, and when it goes to Trump. But there that question of providence and how one understands the 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 activity, guidance, and sovereignty of God in the world, the direction and movement of history, and in relation to nations and people and power. There were a number of discussions about it, and I wonder if you want to kind of show the connections that we see in Bonhoeffer in the first episode to a vision of providence that he ends up growing beyond, and others end up kind of drilling down on, right, and becoming having a more and more narrow view of divine guidance, where it's hard to differentiate the cross and a swastika.
When you're in seminary, did you ever hear the term Heilsgeschichte?
Yes.
Right? Salvation history.
Well, I love some
And,
Pottenberg, so this is a
yeah. And so, there was this, I remember sitting in these classes and I was thinking to myself, man, this is awesome the way God works in history. And so the problem with this is, of course, that when something like the word providence with a capital P gets employed by
yeah,
somebody like Hitler, and he uses this term a lot. It's his theology. He has a theology of providence with a capital P, God working in history. But what it means essentially is that whatever happens historically, God is behind. So if I escape assassination attempt, God was with me. If I become the leader of the country, God was on our shoulder. If we're able to walk in the Sudetenland and take over, or France, or Poland, God is with us. A matter of fact, right, it gets on the belt buckles of the German soldiers, Gott mit uns, God with us. And so, uh, to use a term that seems to be getting used a lot these days, providence becomes weaponized so that you are no longer standing in the way of a social movement. You're no longer opposing a democratic, opponent. You, in fact, are standing in the way of God, God's self. You're standing in the way of providence. And so that notion of providence then becomes a kind of club to beat other people into submission with. This is sort of your archetypal case of bad theology, right? Um, and I think when you look at comments like so and so was saved in the hurricane. Okay, God saved that person in the hurricane. What about all those that didn't survive? Do you see what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So when it moves then into the political order, this bad theology becomes bad politics, because then the sort of political order is given a veneer of authority that is transcendent and can't be called into question. And then you have the ground prepared for all manner of mischief. This is where I think in his book Exclusion and Embrace, Miroslav Volf says, in such a situation, you insert something like the idea of purity. Let's just take racial purity for a minute. And then all of a sudden, you have a situation in which you commit an act of murder and you call it piety. God demanded this. And that raises a lot of uncomfortable questions for me, honestly, about the entirety of Jewish Christian history and the trajectory of Jewish Christian history. But stop there. I see a lot of questions on
Well,
Open City.
we'll definitely get to that topic explicitly in a few weeks. So, but I will say, I think that observation of the 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 claim and desire for purity generates a justification for coercive control, and it is in the our cultural moment is one where there's whole new mechanisms of control coming up, right? And then once the mechanism of control exists in a culture, then there's a desire to use it, right? So not in a few weeks, we'll hear what happens when Hitler seizes control in Germany. What are the mechanisms of changing, right? The Aryan paragraph that gets put in. How's it going to change what we do with the state? How do these insertions of control generate a culture that then begins to enforce that control, where bystanders then ultimately become active subjects to a regime. A part of it, right, is the use of propaganda, and another part is the desire for purity generating legitimation for control. And we face similar things when you're just thinking about the change of technology, the way algorithms work, nudges work, the way that surveillance has grown, the requirement of staying engaged in all sorts of updates to the amount of data about our interiority we don't understand that gets leveraged against us has gone up, right? So just like technologically, the power and potential for control is much bigger than it was then. You throw that on top of culturally, both the left and right do versions of of cultural canceling. They do versions of political correctness. They do versions of purity culture, not just the religious one, but that's definitely one, right? Where there's a kind of otherness of any other practice, embodiment, identity, belief, and you self censor and orient yourself to the collective because the collective's identity is a pure one. And so, if you want to be a part of the group, control yourself, and we all will be subject to it, right? So, there's like when I think of some of the parallels of then and now and what happens at a time where these material and cultural conditions are up, the levers of control that exist in the present um, is so much bigger, right? Than it was then, that it terrifies me. And that's like, and we are at a point where the shift, the kind of surveillance power of AI uh, it's increasing at a level that it's moving from being a tool to an agent, and it's an agent that serves a purpose at a impending level. So like that's why the relevance to it in the present, yes, okay, some of us will notice ones particularly for this moment, but when we realize that purity generates a legitimation of control, that 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 makes me worried, right? And you anyway.
So look, so you're sort of hitting on all the concerns that people who are alert to the social dynamics that we're presently enveloped in, and very difficult for us to see. Hitler's technology, essentially, his employment of the microphone and voice amplification, that was what allowed him, to have the massive rallies. The spectacle could have always been there without that, but the ability to have the massive rallies, was due to that new technology. But the technology, and you hit on this just a minute ago, the technology of creating our interiority, and we're not even aware of how we're being created. So how do we resist the sort of onslaught of technologies that are arrayed against us now? Social, excuse me, social media is one of the technologies that's arrayed against us that creates an interior person. This is what demagogues want to do. They want to create an internal shift in your conscience. Caesar doesn't just want your money. Caesar wants your conscience. And the ability to do that now through the things that you just laid out. It's there's a reason Elon Musk bought Twitter. And it isn't because he wanted to serve humankind. And so now we have this, and one of the things I always appreciate about the biblical sort of vision at this point is one through line running throughout, I think, the entirety of the biblical text is that the rich and the powerful are dangerous
Yeah.
because they
Yeah.
want that control.
Mhm. And they need the control for just the preservation of their power, right? So their place in the world requires control, and I think that's uh, uh, yeah. I mean, I don't want to detour a lot, but mentioning
Well, we've detoured.
I know, but mentioning Elon Musk just makes me and there are other levels of control, right? So if we think of what's happening with in the 20s into the early 30s in Germany, like rampant inflation is one thing. The number of people who were formerly middle class who are now have to work increasing amount of time to service their debt that they didn't have before is there. The rationing of healthcare, the and education, like there are all these things that are involved in that material condition, and one of the others, right, is that things like debt or rationing and these kinds of things generate either the requirement of putting more into the system, which at the moment that system has an Aryan paragraph and is part of a single new culture of Germany, it all gets woven in to generating the energy that sweeps over Germany. Yeah. So,
So for our purposes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead. I have a follow up question, but
Just for our purposes, I think the question then is what kind of faith is it that allows itself to become an agent of increasing social control? What theology is it that desires to control and shape an entire society into one particular understanding? Um, and and I think that really raises questions about what or who is Christianity serving now, right?
mhm. And I think that's why Bonhoeffer is kind of perpetually fascinating. That he was both able to discern the times and ways that he asked the right questions, and then his response was kind of in the profoundly singular one right? Like this kind of call towards discipleship, a deep affirmation of the lordship of Christ that relativizes other claims on his identity. And even the way he understood Christ's presence in relationships, existing in community, and this kind of thing. I to me, that's uh, one of the elements that we'll notice in get honed in the next episode, and like all of a sudden this person we met in episode 1 in Barcelona becomes someone who eventually writes Cost of Discipleship. There's a gap there, and it seems that his kind of his both his Christology, insisting on Christ being the center, and the form of Christian life beginning with the call to discipleship, um, is a different kind of orientation, that that's unique. So I'm interested if you could kind of spell it out, knowing that for some people this is their first time getting to read Bonhoeffer, getting to know much past, like the highlight points or whatnot. How 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 does that how does this kind of Christological center shape the way he's able to imagine an alternative?
Well, there's that German word Stellvertretung, which is vicarious um, representation, um, and that, in a certain sense, Jesus is our representative. You know, he, in some ways, here he kind of follows Paul, right? In Romans, when Paul says, "As in Adam all die, in Christ all shall be made alive." He's not talking about individuals as much as he's talking about a kind of a corporate humanity. And I think in Bonhoeffer, from Sanctorum Communio on, sees Jesus as sort of taking up humanity uh, onto or into himself. And so there's a certain sense then in which Jesus becomes our representative before God, God's representative before us, in such a way that the corporate nature of our relationships with one another changes significantly. So that, not to put too Lutheran a term on it, but Luther talks about sin as being a kind of incurvature into ourselves, and Christ is the one who is, and I'm just putting words in Luther's mouth here, curved out to others. So Jesus is the one who is for others, and the manifestations of Jesus most often are found, for instance, when he writes Christ existing as community, he's talking about the church. He doesn't limit Jesus' presence to the church, but he says the church community is the place where we see the sort of material embodiment of Christ. Would that it were so. But he has that kind of theology then where, and this factors later on in his life too, when he himself is willing to become Stellvertretung to Germany, when he takes upon himself the sins of Germany. But at least in this sort of one core understanding of Jesus, Jesus stands at the center of the relationship between humankind and God as an embodiment of both God to humans and humans to God. And it's not like that it's the grand exchange like we might read in Athanasius or Calvin or somebody, but there's a notion in which Jesus becomes the representative. And in that, there's all kinds of possibilities and potentials for a kind of new life. And the resurrection, in Bonhoeffer's understanding, is the sort of core, or the, not necessarily the beginning, but the core revelation of the new life. It's death from life, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know one of the questions we got was about Kierkegaard and Bonhoeffer's relationship. And when you think of that, the energy of the exchange in Protestantism, it gets picked up by Luther, who the double exchange. What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine. Right. Like so the the exchange in Luther in the event of faith is the analogy is to the trust of the lover at when you're making the exchange of vows. Right. So God says, "What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine." And there's this kind of like deep covenantal. God is the one who has chose us out of love and shows up in love and promises a future of love to all of you. And Luther develops it, and then Kierkegaard picks it up with the story of the king and the maiden, right? That like even that exchange requires a kind of solidarity for it to be received in love. And so the king falls in love with this maiden, but you can't just walk up as a king to a maiden and be like, "Hey, you want to be queen?" She's gonna be like, "Obviously, this is required. Like, look at the power differential." And so he has to go incognito. He has to work in the fields, get dirt under his fingernails and all that kind of stuff, and they have to fall in love genuinely. And then it's in that, like, having had deep solidarity and free exchanging of the fullness of their person, then you can give the invitation to marriage, and one where that power dynamic is shifted. And that kind of energy is like what's sitting there so much in Bonhoeffer, and that kind of deep relational ontology of the vision of the gospel is there. Um, I found this quote in a sermon he gives just not long after getting back from New York, where he says, he puts it this way. He goes, "There's no part of the world, no matter how lost, no matter how godless, that's not been accepted by God and Jesus Christ and reconciled to God. Whoever perceives the body of Christ in faith can no longer speak of the world as if it were lost, as if it were separated from God. They can no longer separate themselves in clerical pride from the world." Right, and in that passage, you hear this Christocentric hermeneutic where the energy of the gospel is one that is potentially present should the disciple attend to it in the encounter of any and every other. And he's going to have to struggle with what that looks like. It's going to grow and expand his vision. But the to me, there's a like deeply personal and relational side of what he means by Christ being at the center. And it's not just that that Christ is with us, and it's not just that Christ is for us, and in a kind of singular event. It's that Christ is with us and for us in each encounter with an
Yes.
image bearer.
Yes. And if we're trying to spend our time figuring out who's on the inside, who's on the outside, we've missed the entire point, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and I think that's one of those. I mean, to me, like, I mean, obviously, we mentioned last time about how we both found Bonhoeffer. You've in letters and papers and stuff, and I was reading Cost Discipleship in middle school, and a cousin gave it to me. Um, but but like one of the things that I just hope everyone pays attention to as we tell the story and as you get to read and hear these conversations is there are very few things Bonhoeffer refuses to reflect and critique or like hold up and like by the end he's like, I don't know if the church should have property. We probably don't need this to be anyone's job. I'm not even sure what we should say uh, other than maybe we're going to serve the Eucharist and tell each other they're forgiven. Like the number of things he thinks is necessary and to be preserved is small, but there's a frame that runs through it, and it's namely that what Christ has called us to is encountered in the face of the other. And then, as we saw in this episode, right, he moves beyond his context, and what does it mean to encounter God in the face of the other when he gets to Barcelona next week? He's going to go to New York. He's going to go to Abyssinian Baptist Church. He's going to go to the movies with Lasserre. They're going to go on a trip, a road trip through the South. He's going to come back, like, and and I think that if you're new to Bonhoeffer and wanting to go, what was it that enabled him to, one, see what's going on in the world, not cultivate contempt for people he thought were working with horribly evil evil powers, and hope for a future beyond the vile explosion that's in front of him. Part of it is that he knew it was above his pay grade to see anyone as bearing something worth dismissing. And that's not because like they have earned it or performed it, right? Like, this is that Protestant principle. It's that they were made in the image of God, and they are the arrival of the opportunity to encounter the Christ again. And that kind of like deep Christological framing, not as a doctrine about the personhood of Jesus, but the presence of Christ in the midst, kind of runs throughout his story. And that encounter with the other continues to make him reevaluate and critique what he's been handed. But it's critiqued, and he's critiquing it on behalf of the Christ he's continued to stay open to. And I think it's so easy when we feel increasingly alone, increasingly ignored, increasingly anxious, when we see the popular expressions of the faith to be things we can't even understand the good news within them, right? To check out, to then demonize and project on, cultivate contempt on the other. And he refused to do it. And that's I think, a beautiful invitation to discipleship that remains kind of perpetually inspiring to me, and like profound in a way that's disturbing, because it invites a kind of self-reflection that doesn't leave you pure. Like, he resists getting to leave himself pure because of his clarity.
Yes. Everything you said. I do want to just sort of mention, for those people who may not be familiar with Bonhoeffer, one of the things that's sometimes difficult for American audience, and maybe in other parts of the world too, because I see on our right that people are here from all over the globe today, but we too often think in terms in Christianity, we think in terms of the individual. And Bonhoeffer was always thinking in terms of the sociality and the relationships among things. It's in the relational aspects where the full Christhood is made present, right? It's in relationships among people where Jesus is made known, where the church is made known. It's in the relationships of the church. So it's never just an individual thing. It's, we'll later on, I think, I don't want to talk about this today, but when he says individual salvation, he just doesn't care, because that's not going to that heart, that Christological center of, in this one particular human, we have the promise and the potential of transforming all our relationships with one another, and transforming them in such a way that, going back to Wolf again, we approach one another with the embrace, not with the hand put up.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for joining the first of the live streams here. You will get a email with the link, so you can rewatch or listen to this later, along with the conversation we had with Reggie, all dialed up for you to listen and enjoy the entirety of it. And then next week we will have the next episode. So
It's amazing.
oh yeah, we're ahead of y'all. So we're just saying it gets better. It gets even better. So
It does.
yeah. So we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks,
And
everybody.
if you are on this, because the first one I left public for anyone, if you haven't joined the class, you can go to riseofbonhoeffer.com, so you can get invited to all the live streams, get the readings and extra interviews and all that kind of stuff. And we'd love for you to tell your friends to go check out the podcast. And make sure you leave a review and thingy, that kind of stuff, because it's a brand new feed. So the more people that connect with it early on, the more people end up finding out about it. And I always get anxious when I've like had a podcast since 2008, and there's just lots of people that are already on it, having a new one, freaking out. So all of you that are members, definitely leave a nice little comment and tell your friends on the Rise of Bonhoeffer podcast feed. So there you go.
And later on, we're going to really get into the thick of this when we hit 1933.
Yes. So buckle